There we go. Hi there. How's it going? Third time was the charm. I'm Entertainment Weekly's editor-in-chief, Patrick Gomez. Thank you all so much for joining us. Game Changers is a franchise that we started at EW earlier this year. It was our way that we wanted to really highlight the people in the industry who were doing the work to make the changes necessary to make sure that Hollywood is an inclusive place, that is a place where everyone feels welcome and everyone is able to do their best work. We have gathered together a group of people here today who are helping do that work, helping make sure that work is being done, and also just by existing in the room are creating change. And so we're very excited to welcome them to this panel. I'm going to notify them from the side of the stage that we did have a swap between the third and the fourth person. So Z, you'll be third. That's a little preview, as you can see. First, we will welcome to the stage Vampire Academy creator Julie Plec. Rutherford Falls creator Sierra Teller Ornelas. The executive producer of Gremlins, Secrets of the Mogwai, and co-founder of TKO Studios, Z Chun. And star of The Walking Dead and Eternals, Lauren Ridloff. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us. I am going to ask this question of the panelists, but also for the people in the room. Growing up, did you feel like you saw yourself represented enough in TV and film? Raise your hand if you felt like you saw yourself represented enough. Even then, I think we could get more specific, and for most of us, I feel like that was the case. I think what I would ask the panelists is, what was that experience like for you? Did you process that at the time, or is that something you didn't really process until later, that you hadn't really seen yourself in media?
Well,
sure. Before I start, Sierra Nelson She, Tabahenishle, Nakadan Ebashichi, Twahakli Dishache, Do Nakadan Additionally. My name is Sierra Teller Ornelas. I am a member of the Navajo Nation. I am Edgewater clan, born for the Mexican people. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's just something we have to do, or my grandma will get mad at me. No, like, of course, no, right? That's like the standard answer. But I just loved film and television so much growing up that I kind of didn't care until I think I got older and started watching. I worked for many years for the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian and found out that, like, I thought Native people just didn't make film and television. We were sort of fodder, in Westerns and that sort of thing. But then I found out we've actually been making films since the 1920s. Some of the first film that was ever recorded was of Native people, and we just were not given an opportunity to tell our story on a mainstream level. And it was then, I think, later on that I got really frustrated with not seeing myself on screen accurately. But growing up, I saw myself in everyone. I was like She-Ra and Don Corleone, and like literally any movie I saw myself in. I didn't realize I was supposed to be seeing myself. And I also had a lot of really beautiful mentors and like strong Native women in my family. But yeah, I think once you kind of get older and see the lack of representation, being on Rutherford Falls or co-creating Rutherford Falls and having scenes where there's like 4 Native people talking to each other, we often will like yell from Video Village, like, we never get this, because it's just such a crazy thing to see. And then that's when it kind of hits you.
I also saw myself in She-Ra, so.
100%.
Was there any other panelists who has a story to share from their experience?
yeah, I can chime in. I think for me, hold on, let me move the mic. Don't need it. I think for myself, it's very similar to what you were just saying. I didn't really realize that I didn't, quote unquote, see myself on the screen because I did not see myself. I didn't have that experience growing up. But I was very creative in finding myself in TV and film. Little pieces here and there. Oh, I see a black woman. Oh, here I see a Mexican woman. Oh, I see here little bits and pieces. And I saw a deaf woman on Sesame Street, Linda Bove, Linda the librarian, and she was signing, but it wasn't really me. Then I saw Marley Matlin on the screen in Children of a Lesser God when I was 8. My parents took me to see the movie, and I was the only kid in the movie theater because the movie was, you know, it's steamy, it's R-rated. It wasn't appropriate for somebody, for me at that age, but my parents really got the importance of me seeing myself on the screen, and they said, no, that's more important than some R rating, so let's go. And I really saw a lot of myself on the screen, but it was a white deaf woman. And for me, you know, so that was my experience growing up.
So what does it mean to start to step into the room and create these stories or portray these stories, and now you're literally seeing yourselves on the screen because of it? Does it feel like that's a win, or does that feel like it's just a first step?
I mean, I think the question of where we saw ourselves or whether we saw ourselves on screen is an interesting one because, you know, when I was growing up, it was Short Round from Indiana Jones and Data from Goonies. And those were, like, I thought very positive portrayals. Same actor doing double duty, but, you know, it was still somebody that I was like, okay, well, maybe this is possible. However, there was never somebody who was like the main character, and there was never a show based around them or a movie based around them. And I think what happens when that is the case is over many years, as I was starting to get into film and TV, there were the stories I wanted to tell, but it was always within the context of, okay, I know that I want to tell the story, and it might be autobiographical to some point, deal with some of the things I'm dealing with, but it will always have to be a white main character. And trying to hide that experience of, like, you know, being a child of immigrants, maybe feeling alienated, and trying to figure out how to tell that story with white main characters, I never really had success doing that. And it wasn't until I felt like, okay, well, I can take a chance. I was doing indie film at the time. And I made a very autobiographical short film called Window Breaker. And I had made 12 short films up until that point. Probably did more in high school. But that was the one that kind of broke through. And I started thinking to myself, well, okay, well, even if I'm not going to be able to do something at the scale of a big blockbuster, maybe I can start telling these stories on a smaller scale. So I did my first feature, Children of Invention, which was also, you know, Chinese-American cast. And I think there's been this really interesting change in the last 10 years. The fact that I was able to make kind of a third movie in that trilogy, or third story in that trilogy with Little America, which was also semi-autobiographical based on my mom's life. And that was on Apple, streaming into millions of homes. And the fact that now I'm able to do Gremlins, Secrets of the Mogwai, with a, you know, pretty much all Asian cast is really remarkable to me. So I do think that there's, you know, we talk about progress, and I do think in the last 10 years I've seen a lot of change in the industry.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, you made me actually think about the gaze. And I feel like when you see deaf people on the screen, you know, you see them, but it doesn't feel right oftentimes, you know, when I'm watching that, because you see it from a hearing person's perspective, their gaze into that. And that's one thing that I'm very excited about now, is that I feel like things in the last few years have started to shift. And I feel like at the time, you know, when you see a deaf person on the screen, you know, that gaze is becoming closer to my own gaze. And that's something that I'm looking forward to and striving for. And I think now I'm an executive producer on a show with Ava DuVernay and Joshua Jackson. And, you know, and that's going to be streaming on Stars. And it means so much to me, because to be heavily involved with the story development and the creation. And again, that establishes that lens. And I really just want people to see things the way that I see things.
I could jump on that for just a minute. I'm the co-creator of Rutherford Falls, which is a show streaming now on Peacock. Please watch it. But it's a show co-created with Mike Schur and Ed Helms. They'd had the idea. It centers on two best friends, a white man and a Native woman, and how they sort of are two nerds against the world. They're both really into museums, and they're both sort of reconciling with their own histories in different ways. And so, Mike and Ed had kind of come up with the idea of this Nathan Rutherford character, and then they realized that they wanted, indigenous storylines. They were like, well, we shouldn't do this by ourselves, and they'd both worked with me. I'd worked previously on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and I'd developed with Ed, and so they brought me in. And usually the experience of like a native writer is you get a call like at the end, like they're like, we're shooting on Monday, can you take a look at the script and like tell us we did a good job? And you're like, no, it's terrible, and there's no way to change it, and they've cast non-native actors, and it's just a nightmare. And so to be brought in at the beginning of a situation and to develop it for like a year, and like having half characters and being like, nope, this is what the Native woman would be like, and this is what the Native guy would be like, and there should actually be 10 more Native characters, and just getting to have that voice in the room and having those allies accepting that voice, I think was just such a great experience, because I'd come up in network television and knew how to speak that language with them, and them really stepping up and learning how to speak my language. But exactly, like getting to infuse your gaze in from the ground floor is just so integral to telling these stories.
Julie, how often were you the only woman in the room when you first were starting out?
I was the only woman in fact, the reason I got my first writing job was because we had one woman on the staff whose pilot got picked up, and so she had to leave, and I was a producer on the show. I wasn't a writer yet. And they were sort of like, do you want to come write on the show so that we have a woman? And I said, sure.
I guess that's progress, that they at least wanted that.
But I feel weirdly responsible because I think I helped staff that room. So I sort of created that problem in the first place where there was only one woman. But we did work in a later season with a female comedy writer. And she would tell these stories of being in room after room after room, of being the only woman in these comedy rooms, surrounded by basically straight white men who just tormented her. And I was really, really thrown by that, and not realizing on the comedy side specifically what, even until today, probably a lot of women had to deal with. It sounded really unkind.
We all are the main characters of our own stories, but what Julie just said was a moment that she realized what someone else was experiencing, and that was kind of eye-opening. Have you all had your own eye-opening experiences about how others are facing adversity in the industry?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had people DM me who are neurodivergent or, have different disabilities, and there's different organizations through the WGA that I'll try to connect them to, but they have a lot of questions, and I think it's, it's an interesting conversation because I think there's just so many different types of people who have stories that are exciting to tell, and it is the industry is so set in a very specific way, finding those inroads is so difficult, but it's also you're missing out on all these amazing stories.
I also think that there's something interesting about people individually who see themselves as, Hollywood liberals and wanting to do things a certain way, but the power structures and the way things are set up are kind of antithetical to that. So I always felt that when I worked for 6 years in network television, and for 5 of those years I was the only person of color in the room. For 3 of those years, there was only 1 woman in the writer's room out of 10 people, and it was hard to go into the room every day and see things that seemed offhand because they were said by people who were in power, but somebody saying, no one's ever going to care about the female characters on our show, as if it was the absolute. And there's only one, lower level female writer in the writer's room, and seeing how that affected her. And I remember walking out and saying, I'm so sorry. And she was like, I'm quitting and you should quit too.
Oh, wow.
And I brought a lot of that when I was going to the writer's room every day and seeing it was all white writers, all the support staff were people of color. I was feeling very alienated. And it was a really difficult time. And there were also things that were kind of, I'm sure everyone here has experienced these types of microaggressions. These were kind of like macroaggressions. Day one of second year I was on a show walking down the hall and the executive producer being like, "You look just like a Viet Cong." And I was like,
Oh my God.
I was like, why would you even think that, let alone saying that out loud? And then when we confronted that same person about we need more women in the writer's room, without batting an eye, he said, "Oh, you're telling me I'm single." So it was a level of horridness that was so terrible. But what I found was, and I don't know if this was the right way to deal with it, but there was a moment where I felt that I was getting angry 100 times a day. And I had to figure out a way where I could still do my job. And so I just concentrated on, I needed to work my way up in the writer's room as quickly as possible so that I could be in the hiring position next time. And then when I was in the hiring position, I would never staff up a room or a crew in the way that I had experienced in those places.
I had a moment that was illuminating in full context, and it speaks to this sort of systemic problem, which is we had a black actor on a show I was producing who really wanted to be able to have a barber on his team. And the studio said, "No, there's no barber's not a union position. Barber, we can't pay an extra this. He can go to a barber." And it was this war that we fought as bosses to try to get this man what he needed. And we fought and we fought and we fought, and finally, at the end of it all, we were able to get him reimbursed for his own barber so that he could go and do that on, his time off. And we, the nice, well-meaning, somewhat oblivious white bosses, felt good enough about what we had accomplished on his behalf. And then we wrote a scene where it's a supernatural show where he's sitting in a cemetery and blood rain starts falling from the sky. Oh, God. And he said, "Do you have any understanding of what me sitting in the rain will, what that will do to my hair?" And we said, "What do you mean?" And felt so dumb and so ill-equipped for the moment, because here we were patting ourselves on the back for getting him some off-site barber that he had to drive to on his day off. And then we write a scene which just confirms his perspective, which is that none of us are there as allies. And I think, and then a couple years later, when the big conversation started about specifically black hair and makeup, and you started hearing all the testimonials of people and all the experience that they had gone through, and you're hearing these testimonials and being like, "Oh my God," and there I was congratulating myself for getting a small win out of the studio, not even realizing what it made him feel like to have to fight for that in the first place, and then ultimately not get it. And I think that a lot of us, who think we're allies, don't really have a fully rounded understanding because it's not our lived experience. And I think the work that a lot of us can do, if we want to call ourselves allies, is to learn more about what it means to really be an ally, to understand things like black hair in the rain, and that kind of thing. And I think that's where we have the most work to do. Certainly people like me, where I feel like I have the most work to do.
Yeah, and I wanted to add in, I definitely want to applaud that actor who actually spoke up and know how to express their needs, because that moment for me, that wake-up call, that epiphany that I had, was actually recent. And I'm still new to this industry, and I was joining this huge, budget, film, it's this huge franchise, and my feeling was the same. And I definitely understand what you were saying, that feeling of gratitude. I felt so lucky to be there. I'm so lucky to occupy this space in Hollywood. Wow, I'm so grateful I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me. I don't want to ask for too much. And I felt like, I already went through the trouble of having accessibility for myself. And I don't want to ask for anything else until I had a moment in a trailer, and it was that same experience, actually, with another actor. My hair is the same, and I love my hair and makeup person that I had on this show, on this movie. Very sweet lady, but she didn't know how to work with my hair. She had no idea how to do it. She needed a lot of support from other people in the trailer, and it took 3 people to do my hair. It took 6 hours, and I had to do my off time. On my day off, they had to come to my hotel room, lay on my bed so they could make it happen. It was a process. And I bared with it. I did it. I didn't say anything because I didn't know I could ask for somebody with experience with textured hair. I thought that, it just didn't even come to me. So I bared with it, and I went through it. And one of my castmates was sitting right next to me, and who's also black. And I noticed that there was a new person in the trailer, because he had his regular hair and makeup person, but he had somebody come in. I was like, who's this person cutting your hair? I'm like, who is he? He's like, oh, this is the guy that flew in from LA to cut my hair. It's a barber. And I was like, wait, they flew somebody in? They flew your barber in? He's like, yeah, of course. I was like, wait, you asked for that and they did it? Yeah, you should too. And I was like, really, this is something you can do? And I was just afraid of asking too much because I already made specific requests, because I am deaf. And then my hair, I thought it was too much. I didn't want to be that actor who was so demanding. But it was a wake-up moment for me. And I realized, I'm investing my time. And so just for my hair, I want to deliver and I wanted to act. I want to do my job. And by doing my job, I have to have certain things to meet my needs. As a deaf person and as a biracial person, I have this hair. And so it was a big wake-up call for me. And I was like, so after that, I felt so much more courageous to make those asks.
And I do feel like, had you made that ask prior to 2020, the answer would have been no.
Right, and you would have been difficult, and it would have
Yeah,
been, you know what I mean? So it makes sense to have that sort of apprehension, because I think
Yeah.
a lot of people still feel that way. It's very difficult. I did channel a lot of my old white bosses, like first year of show running, because I was like, well, he did it 5 years ago, or this happened, and I want it this way. And it was a fine line of finding that like respectful way to do it, but it is so hard to kind of, like Michael Grey Eyes, who plays Terry Thomas on our show, is a very seasoned actor. He's been on Walking Dead and a bunch of shows. Talks about, as a Native man, on most sets, he has to also be a cultural consultant, and he has to be a co-writer and sometimes a co-director, and then he gets to act. And so to be on a set where the writer and the producer's a Native, the director's Native, he was like, to just get to act is such a gift, and it's something he's kind of never experienced before on this level. And I think there's a reason why, like, a lot of people have noticed him, and he got, nominated for an Independent Spirit Award, and I think part of that comes from the fact that he gets to just perform at his like top level versus having to slow down to worry about things like, is my hair correct? Is my, is this costume correct? Do I have to research this on my own? Do I have to rewrite these lines? Is the indigenous language correct? He just knew we had his back.
That leads me to ask, are you able to let all that go and just get into process, to get into what seemingly other people just walk in the room and do the job? And are you able to let that go at any point, or is it always there?
I would say yes and no. Season 2, we had set up a lot in season 1. We had some really rough conversations, and we were the first technically Native American sitcom in the US, so Reservation Dogs came out a couple months after us. And so at the time we were making it, we really didn't know, I'm like a superstitious Navajo, so I was like, this will just never be on TV. And then like our first production meeting, COVID happened and we got shut down, so I was like, I told you. But we eventually got to make the show. So that first season, we put everything in there. We did like a This Is Us episode, we did like a very special episode, we did, all different kinds, just to be like, we can do Blackish, we can do anything, and so season 2, we got to kind of slow down. There was more Native content out there, and we just focused on the stuff we loved, like what are the relationships we enjoy, what is the comedy, and to me that felt almost as revolutionary as what we were trying to do with season 1, because we got to just exist as a TV show, and it really was so much fun to just like make comedy with a bunch of other Native people and Ed Helms.
I think when you're show running, one of the things I always talk about is that you have a finite number of resources always, but to me the most important resource to kind of hoard and expend and be aware of is the morale of the writers and the crew. And I know that for myself, there were years where I would let things eat away at me, not say something because of everything that we're talking about. Am I asking too much? Am I going to be a problem in the room? And one of the things I've found is it is hard because everybody comes from different, it's not even just race, it's class, it's sex, it's so many things that you can't always live inside of, but what you can do is you can create an environment on day one where people are empowered to speak up about anything. If they feel that a storyline, we had something on a show that was show running where we never thought it was like a culturally sensitive topic or anything, but there was an assistant who was concerned and brought it up to us, and I was like so happy that we had created an environment where an assistant who was really had only been there for like a month could walk up to the showrunner and say, I would like to talk to you about this. And I also thought it was very important that when we addressed it, she knew that she was listened to, and that everybody else, who she was friends with on the crew knew that that was possible on our show, because I've seen morale get torn apart by people holding stuff in, not feeling like they're listened to. And I think as a manager and a showrunner is basically a writer with managerial capacities. I think it's very important to make people, regardless of level, know that they're being heard and their concerns are being dealt with.
It's beautiful. Julie, I know you've been wanting to make Vampire Academy for a very long time, and this is finally coming to fruition. We're going to get it in just a
Yes,
couple
we
months. Tell us a little bit about that journey and why it was important to tell a story that was so focused on female relationships. And you've said it's a story for our time. So why is now the right time for this show?
Funnily enough, the books that I first read them in 2007, 2008 when they started coming out, and what I read into them at that moment was this really beautiful story about a true lifelong female friendship, and the power of these two women as they made their way from adolescence into adulthood in a very rarefied society. And so when I was given the opportunity to make the show in 2021, I pitched it was like Bridgerton with vampires, y'all. Let's make it. And then everybody was like, woo, yeah, Bridgerton with vampires, we are in. And then we opened our writer's room and we reread the books. And it was Marguerite McIntyre, who's my co-showrunner, and myself rereading these books and being like, so this society is really imbalanced. It's really on edge. There's a class bias. There's an elitism built into it, and we finally started seeing, because of where we were in our moment in time, all of the threads that Rochelle Mead, the novelist, had laid in there in terms of it. She really had built a story about an imbalanced society that was ready to implode, and it just feels like right now we're all kind of collectively living that experience, that feeling of like an economic disparity or a cultural disparity, and everything always feels like we're in such a pressure cooker. And this show ultimately centered around these two women and this really beautiful friendship is actually the origin story of two revolutionaries who are going to, once they realize the society that they're living in is not built for them, are going to work together to dismantle it. And so I called the network and I'm like, so yeah, Bridgerton, that was like a great pitch, but I think we're making the Hunger Games now. and it actually felt great to realize, like, we're not just telling a story that we know will appeal to the fans of the genre or people who like to look at sexy vampires or pretty pictures of castles and ball gowns and stuff. We are telling a story about, like, sort of speaking truth to power and standing up against the kind of systemic, in this case, it's not totally a patriarchy, but it may as well be, and trying to be the change that, and act to make the change that the world needs. So it's really exciting because it's super entertaining, but it's got a message.
We're excited to see it. We've spoken a lot about film and TV. I want to take a moment to talk about TKO Studios, which produces comics and graphic novels. Z, tell us a little bit about TKO and making sure that there's diversity in that forum as well.
So TKO Studios is a comic book company that I co-founded. We launched in 2018, December, so we've been around for about 3.5 years. And part of it was I came up through independent film, and I always felt like I could just make something. If I wanted a story to exist, I could just make it and force it through. It's a lot harder, when you're dealing with studios and networks and projects die all the time. And I felt initially that I wanted to launch this company so that I could know that my stories could exist first as a comic book and just be out in the world. But when we started the company, I also felt the responsibility to kind of champion voices that haven't necessarily been heard before. And that can, again, come from anywhere. It could come from underrepresented voices in terms of, it could be anything, even if it's just a specific experience in someone's life. And, we really pride ourselves in telling stories that other publishers won't. One of our first launch titles was a book called Goodnight Paradise, which is about, it's a murder mystery, but it's set in the homeless population in Venice, California, and downtown LA. And it's a project that a lot of publishers wouldn't have touched, but it was something that was so lived in by the writer that we felt that it was kind of our responsibility to take that on. And we publish books, but we have 2 books by Roxane Gay. We have books by Jeff Lemire. We have like AAA writers, AAA artists, but we also always try to balance it with giving people their first shot at telling a story in that medium.
Speaking of comics, Lauren, obviously you've gotten to play on 2 different projects that stem from very popular comics. What have you seen it mean to fans to see you on Walking Dead and Eternals?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What has it meant? Have people come up to you or fans expressed just how grateful they are to see you on a project like Walking Dead or Eternals? Do they feel represented? And how does that make you feel?
Well, when you actually said fans, I assume you mean deaf fans? Because I'm saying that because I feel like generally fans feel very seen. I have had a wonderful experience. I went to Saudi Arabia recently to a fan convention, and I met a lot of people there who loved the movie and really enjoyed my work, but it wasn't because I was deaf. They were all hearing, but it was because what the movie meant and the people a part of that movie. They saw themselves on the screen in that movie, and that was very touching. But for deaf fans, the impression that I get is that deaf fans really enjoy what they have seen thus far. Connie on The Walking Dead, Makari, that speedster in The Eternals, but that's it. They want more. And I think deaf fans are just not satisfied. They need more. Is that it? We want to see more of you. We want to see more deaf people on the screen. And I feel like oftentimes, in the past, I feel that Hollywood it's a small place. It's a small community. And there's only enough room for 1 or 2 deaf people. That's about it. That's enough. And I think that was the mindset for so many years. And I think now I've been a part of these different productions. I'm like, no, there is plenty of room here for more deaf talent. And it's so important to have deaf talent in front of the camera because that is what people in the audience see. They see themselves on the screen. Like I said earlier, that gaze that I was talking about, we're not there yet. And I think it's really important to bring more people in off screen, behind the camera. That way we can develop those stories like what you were just saying. It's our responsibility to tell those stories. And I know that what deaf fans want is more stories that are just authentic, truly.
Well, from comics to comedy, there's a refrain, at least on the internet, that you can't make jokes anymore. You like everything's too PC. You can't be funny about anything. Everything's too sensitive. Sarah, working on a fantastic and very funny comedy that tackles very delicate situations that could have been dealt with horribly by a different group of people. Talk to us a little bit about what it is like to write comedy in 2022.
I like it. I don't know. I mean, I'm getting older, and I know some of the stuff I say, I don't think I could say 10 years ago, or there were jokes I laughed at. Comedy spoils, that's what they say. So you can go back and watch a drama, and it's still as good as the day it came out. Mike Schur has this thing where it's like comedy from 10 years ago is probably offensive, and 30 years ago doesn't even make sense. It's like a different language, you know? So what I like about comedy is you kind of let it exist, and then it can go away, and you make new comedy today. We punch up. That's the big thing for us. So, you know, we make sure that everyone is in on the joke, because I feel like for so many years, marginalized people have been the joke. But that said, there's also just a shared comedic language we have in the room. Like Janice Meeting is a comedy encyclopedia and loves, you know, her guiding light is like Chris Farley. So she'll be like, I want to do a pratfall like Chris Farley, or I want to get kicked in the face, or I want to. And so sometimes, you know, we are all native, or a lot of the writers are native. But a lot of the writers on our show like wrote on SNL and did a lot of other stuff. And so some of the stuff we grew up on loving, you know, they'll be like, oh, we wrote that. I was like, what, you wrote Turd Ferguson or whatever, you know? And so for us, I think that, you know, we're speaking a lot of languages in the room, and the important thing for all of us is that each language is valued. But a lot of the adage growing up in writers' rooms was, it should be a safe space where everyone can say how they feel. And I feel like 10 years ago it was really like, no, it's a safe space for these like 4 dudes to say how they feel, and then everyone else just nods and agrees. And so what we try to do in the writer's room is really have that be true for everybody. And it's difficult for everyone, because I think, you know, the people who aren't well-versed in Native stuff have to be allowed to make mistakes and ask stupid questions and kind of, you know, put their foot in their mouth. And at the same time, the less seasoned writers, or some writers from certain communities, have to have the space to grow and learn, and also just say how they actually feel. And the great thing about our room, sorry if I'm talking too long, is that seasoned comedy writers have heard it all and seen it all and done it all. So if you have a Native person talking about, like, you know, a land home site lease storyline, that's something new that comedy writer has never learned. So as a comedy writer, they're just excited for a new story, and that I feel like is where it's like a perfect marriage in our room of like new stories and really funny people, and we're all kind of learning from each other. So I like making comedy. I don't buy that. I think the more offensive you are, the better the joke should be. And I think there's just a lot of people who've gotten away with telling offensive jokes for the sake of being offensive. But if it's really, really funny, I mean, it's a visceral response. People will laugh if something's funny, and that is what I like about what I do. But I don't think it has to be like the biggest downer to make comedy in 2022.
We obviously have made major strides in calls for diversity, and luckily people look at that as a positive now, not just in film and TV, but I know in marketing, and you know, companies want to put forth as diverse a billboard as possible. Have you seen that become an easier process for those of you? I mean, all of you are producers and work and building rooms and casting and making those sorts of decisions. Do you find it's easy enough to find the diverse talent that you're looking for, or is it still hard for those people to get into the room?
I would I would say that the biggest barrier to entry is what's happening inside at the sort of, again, the buzzword of the day, let's take a shot every time I say it, the systemic level. Because we will say, for example, hey, we really need to make sure that our crew is representative of the world that we live in, and that specifically this cast is really really well-rounded, and I don't want to put this cast on day one on a set that it doesn't look like them. And the line producer says, oh, yeah, absolutely. And then, you know, 3 weeks later, the line producer's like, oh, I've hired all these people. And you said, okay, well, where's the diversity? Well, no one's available. Right. And okay, well, that doesn't sound right. So why don't we dig a little deeper? And then you get on the phone with the production people that, you know, are trying to manage the budget, and they say, well, no one local is available. And we say, well, did you look at Array? Did you look at Ava's website? That doesn't really help. That's not really useful, you know? And then you get the, I say, well, we're not gonna shoot without a crew that that makes everybody feel good about coming to work. And they say, well, I mean, we can't bring in a hairstylist from, you know, Australia. And I say, can't you? Like, what's preventing you from being able to do that? And the answer is money. the answer is money. The bottom line is always the barrier to entry because everyone is just so concerned about how to make the money work that they get blinders on about how to successfully diversify the people that they're hiring. And it is astonishing. Even someone, if I start on day one and say, we're not shooting unless we have this, it still can take up to quite literally the day of shooting to get it. And with a lot of threats and a lot of, kicking and screaming. And it's astonishing to watch happen in real time.
And that's emotional currency you're sacrificing on the A side. So if you need something on the B side later, when it comes to marketing or when it comes to promotion, you've spent that emotional currency on this when you should have had to, No, I also think the algorithm's racist. It just is. There's all this data that's sort of flowing through and you're able to judge oh, this is what's going to be popular or this is what we want to buy. But I don't exist on the algorithm, right? I don't have any threads through that system yet. And so when you're trying to build an algorithm from scratch, it's really hard to it's like you're dealing with this fire hose that you're trying to swim through, and it just takes a minute for us to kind of cultivate all of these different projects to even be in the whatever widgets of order to be suggested by the algorithm. And so it's really difficult, I think, to start this, but there's a lot of native content happening now, which is very exciting. But I'm always afraid it's going to go away. I'm always afraid that this is a renaissance and not just how it's going to be. And so much of this right now is everyone who has a native show trying to hire native writers who've never written, going into community, going into comedy groups, going online, and pulling people up and being do you want to be a writer? Do you want to be a director? And finding these people who've been directing short films forever. It still boggles my mind that, at Sundance, a white guy making a short film can get a Jurassic Park movie. But I know guys who've directed multiple features that are really good that cannot break into television. Wow. So I think systemically, it's just one of those things where having more people that are diverse in positions of power saying no, this is what I want. I have an amazing production team. My sure shows are always 50% gender parity. I've Morgan Sackett is the best producer ever. But there were moments where, we wanted a native composer because those sounds have always been misused of drums and rattles, and just native sounds have always been misused in television. And I was there's a band I want to use. They use that music specifically. And so we have two co-composers. We have The Hallucination and we have David Schwartz. David Schwartz is an amazing composer, and it was about kind of making space for people who've never done it before, because that's how we have native composers now, and so it's about creating those positions and making those demands.
But we can't afford that, Oh, are you going to take that out of the budget somewhere else?
Right.
If you want two composers, well then, are you going to give up, a shooting day? I mean, it's the bartering, the exchange. It's incredible.
It's crazy.
Lauren, I know you spoke at a panel yesterday for the Inevitable Foundation, which is working to advocate for the deaf community in film and TV. Sierra, I know that you had an experience getting to work with the ABC and Disney Television Group's diversity writing program. How important are organizations like that to funnel up-and-coming talent into a safe space where they can feel like they can thrive and grow into this industry?
Well, what we were just actually talking about, I think it's really challenging to find people who have enough qualifications or enough experience, I should say, because they haven't had access. They haven't had an in until now. So I think, that's why I like working with the Inevitable. The show that I'm talking about with Ava and Josh that I'm producing right now, I'm just so thrilled because now as an executive producer, I have a chance to start here at the very top level and make sure things are set and moved in the right space. And we are now looking for deaf writers. And I know that there are plenty of deaf writers out there, but there are not enough with experience or the credentials, so to speak. And there's only a handful that are in the WGA. So that's where it comes in to be so important, and that's why the foundation is so important, to bring in deaf writers. And it's so critical to push for that change. And as I said before, that gaze, I'm obsessed with that word apparently today, and where we can fix that gaze. And we need to make those steps. We need writers in the room who we need representation in the writers' room. And I think that I'm thrilled to be working with that organization for that purpose.
I think that what Lauren is saying is really interesting in that there is always the perception that there's not the qualified individuals that are, say, for an Asian American project, there might not be as many Asian American directors or board artists or writers because they may not have had those opportunities in the past. The talent development has not been there. And one of the things that I feel thankful for is as a showrunner, I can push, and I've had good allies on the studio and network side to say, yes, we want to give people their first step up to go from board artist to director, or giving them the opportunity to do something they haven't done before. And what I think is really interesting is, for a lot of the industry, when you say you're giving somebody their first opportunity, they think, oh, well, what happens if they can't do it, right? But to me, it's actually less risk, because if you're giving somebody an opportunity that I know that they're qualified for, they'll give it their all, and they will try so hard to succeed. And I also know that we have a environment where we should all be helping each other on a show that I'm working on. In terms of the diversity programs for writing, I think it's certainly helpful on the getting diverse writers their first writing jobs. I think where it becomes harder is there is kind of a bottleneck where at a certain level, you might be a mid-level writer and it's hard to break through to that upper-level showrunner, executive producer, co-EP level. And I don't really know what the answer is. One of the things I have brought up is, like, while studios have when at a studio I was talking to people about, like, what does the diversity training program look like, and immediately everyone was talking about, well, for lower-level writers, entry-level writers, but that's not really the place where I feel like things are missing. Things are missing where you're training somebody to take that step where they are actually in the hiring position, because then it can become self-perpetuating. And if a studio would create a program like that, like individual showrunner training programs, that would be great. I try to talk to, like, a mid-level writer or lower-level writer every week, even if I don't know them, even if someone just reached out via Twitter, and just have an hour-long conversation with them, because, like, I want something that's self-perpetuating where, one day maybe we won't have any more of these panels.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, you talk about
Really quickly, Julie, I just really want to say, if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to come line up. We don't have much more time, but we want to make sure we get to those. But Julie, go right ahead.
Well, you mentioned allies at the studio, which I, having just complained about, where the roadblocks are, what I've also seen is when you do have allies at the studio, how much they are willing to do to break their own rules. And just specifically to Vampire Academy, we really wanted to make sure we didn't have token representation in the room. And so that meant needing to have a very large room. And the people that we found that we wanted to hire happened to end up being high-level co-EPs with a price tag, and usually you can afford one. And we said, well, we need 3, and they went to bat for us against their own money people and broke all their rules so that we could afford to build this writing team that reflected our goals. And when you get that, suddenly everyone feels like they're working for the right goal in the right way, but it's hard to find. And I'm hoping it's getting easier and easier, because sometimes I'll just pick up the phone and call the DEI department, at a studio and say, hey, your production department isn't letting me do this. Can you go yell at somebody?
Yeah.
And they do. And they kick up a fuss and they yell and they kick and scream, and all of a sudden you get what you need. So it's about, activating those resources and kind of commanding and demanding allyship at the financial level too.
Beautiful. I know we have this one question here.
just want to say I'm a Coda, and I thank you so much for your representation in the Eternals. It was like being home. My dad moved to the East Coast, and we're so far away, but it felt like home.
Wow.
So beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And my question is, as an EP,
You're making me tear up. What you just said, sorry, I need a moment. Okay, go ahead.
as an EP, is the goal to have deaf people working at every level? Because I know that right now, with the way deaf education is set up, it's not fully supportive to deaf students, and professional careers aren't really open to the deaf community. So as a plan, sorry, I'm gonna stop some going.
Yeah, go ahead. So are you planning on, is your goal then to have deaf people, deaf professionals at every level of the show, behind the scenes, working on the crew and throughout, as well as, having the cast also be deaf? Yeah, well, that is actually a great question, because first of all, I have to say, it's not going to be a full deaf cast, because the storyline really is it's a snippet of what the real world is. So there is going to be a mixed cast. It is, my goal to include many deaf people at every level. I want deaf people there. I want deaf hair and makeup artists. That's important to me, because I feel like there are better ways to actually break those stereotypes that we are stuck with. And because if you're not really breathing true life, there are not real deaf people there, how can you actually create stories on the screen for people to actually see that are real and feel real? So yes, it is vital for me to actually include deaf people in every level. Yes, will it happen? I don't know, but that is my intention. And as you mentioned earlier, deaf schools and, have a lot of lower expectations. That's real, it's true. And what I see in TV and film is so powerful. They're powerful tools to shift that framework and to change that framework. So people will feel seen and represented, and different kinds of deaf people on the screen. And I want to make sure that that is going to be a ripple effect. That's the goal. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate it.
I guess we only have time for one more question.
All right. Apology to the rest of the line.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm very short. Sierra, I want to say thank you so much for Rutherford Falls.
Thank you.
It's something I didn't have growing up, being able to see, part of me on screen. I wanted to ask you, but also the panel, now that, there is more representation, there's still a long way to go, but now that you have ascended into position of leadership, what do you do when you're in the room and you still do hear those inappropriate comments or, people acting inappropriately?
I mean, I'm the boss, so I'll just say stop doing that. And I don't really hire people who do that. I mean, I think, again, comedy is about turns at bat, and sometimes you whiff, and sometimes, so I think you have to kind of allow for people to but most of the comedy people I'm around, we had a day where there was a kind of kerfuffle, and this guy kept talking over people. He's just very boisterous, and we talked to him about it, and when you're pitching, especially on Zoom, it's so hard because you don't know. And I remember he felt so bad about it, and someone was like, no, go ahead. And he goes, no, you go. And she's like, no, it's okay. He goes, I'd rather die. And it was so sweet. And she was like, that's the coolest thing anyone's ever said to me in a room. And so, you learn and you grow. So it's giving writers room to grow, but it's making, I do a speech at the beginning, I'm sure everyone does, of these are the expectations, this is what's expected of you, and it's for everybody, because there's, everyone has expectations, but I think you just kind of speak truth to power, and also you can just mock them, because you're comedians, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, I thank all of you for being here. I thank all of you for being here. As you said, the goal is to never have to have these panels anymore. But until
100%.
that time, we have to do them. And so we're very gracious that you took the time to do it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a fantastic rest of your Comic-Con.